All right, so where we left off was talking about, we were going to start talking about the how all of these different kinds of white blood cells fit together. So let's do that. So leukocyte is another word for white blood cell, which includes all immune cells we have ever talked about and some cells that we haven't even talked about yet. So leukocyte, leuko means white, leukocytes are just white blood cells, all of the different kinds of immune cells together. Lymphocytes are specifically cells involved with adaptive immunity. So that's the stuff from last week. So that's going to be T cells, B cells, also natural killer cells count as a lymphocyte because remember, even though natural killer cells have a more generalized response, they don't generate immune system memory, but they come from the same cells as T cells. Okay, so T cells, natural killer cells, they both talk, they both talk to MHCs. They come from the same cell lines, so they still count as lymphocytes. So B cells, T cells, and the related natural killer cells are all lymphocytes. So let's put all this together. So let's scale out now to blood. So let's talk about the bloodstream. In your veins and arteries, you have this liquid in which everything else is floating, and that liquid is called plasma. Plasma has a lot of stuff dissolved in it. It's got all kinds of proteins dissolved in it with different functions, some immune, some not. It's got all the gases that you like oxygen, carbon dioxide dissolved in them. It's got nutrients, electrolytes. We're not going to go into plasma, but plasma is not just water. It has many, many important functions for health, and for nutrition, for health, for gas exchange, for immunity, just dissolved in the plasma itself. But we're just going to call it the liquid that everything else is floating in. So you have the plasma and then you have formed elements. So plasma makes up the majority of what's in your veins and arteries. Formed elements are the cells. So it's about 65% plasma and 55% cells by volume. Cells include red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, platelets, which what platelets do is they help stop bleeding when you get a wound. So they clog a site of a wound site so that you don't bleed out. And they do it temporarily until you're able to form a scab and new tissue. And your white blood cells are your leukocytes. So red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. White blood cells are also called leukocytes. Now, the only true cells of the formed elements are white blood cells. Red blood cells and platelets are not true cells. They come from true cells, but they are not true cells themselves. They don't have organelles. They don't even have a nucleus. They came from a true cell, but they are not true cells. All right, so let's start with red blood cells or erythrocytes. I just want to take this opportunity, since we're getting towards the final, to do a little bit of review. So I'm going to do this all Dora the Explorer style. I'm going to ask a question and pause so that you have time to think about it before I answer it for you. Why must red blood cells transport oxygen to all the cells in your body? So the job of red blood cells is to transport oxygen through your body, from your lungs to the rest of the tissues in your body. Why is that role important? Why, in other words, why do all the cells in your body need oxygen? This goes back to metabolism, so I'll give you a moment to think about it. So all the cells in your body need oxygen for aerobic respiration, and I'm sure all of you got that, but what I really want you to know for the final is the role oxygen plays in aerobic respiration. Oxygen is necessary to clear electrons that are used already from the electron transport chain. So remember, you get high energy electrons from your food. Those high energy electrons are stripped from your food. They are passed down the electron transport chain in the mitochondria to pump protons. Then all the energy in them is transferred to that proton gradient. The proton gradient drives ATP synthase, which generates ATP for the body. If those electrons are not removed from the electron transport chain, the electron transport chain grinds to a halt. So if the electrons are not removed at the end, all those enzyme complexes get backed up with electrons. They can't move electrons anymore, which means they're no longer harvesting energy from the electrons to pump protons, which means the proton gradient disintegrates, which means there's no proton gradient to drive ATP synthase, which means ATP synthesis stops and the cell runs out of energy to live. And so the cells in the body die. So oxygen, like we talked about, has a lot of toxic effects in the body, but it is essential for clearing the electron transport chain to keep it running. And so when you run out of oxygen, that is the reason you die. It's the only thing we use atmospheric oxygen for. And so that goes to show how important it is to keep the electron transport chain running. All right, platelets. So platelets help with blood clotting. Why is blood clotting important to containing an infection? So blood clotting is important to containing an infection. I mean, yes, it stops you from bleeding, but also it stops pathogens from getting in, because remember, your skin is a great barrier against infection. And so platelets are part of what stops those pathogens from entering through a break in your skin barrier. And I'm going to take this opportunity to also review what pathogens do to evade being isolated by clotting. So you have platelets that help initiate blood clotting at the site of a wound, but that's to stop pathogens from getting in, but some pathogens can still get in. And how is that? So some pathogens have kinases that break down those blood clots, okay? So I'm going to take, because a lot of this is already reviewed from the adaptive immune system, I'm going to take this opportunity to continue trying to remind you of what came before earlier in the term, because we're getting to the final, and the final's cumulative. All right, so we have the plasma, which is the liquid, that's 65% of blood. Then we have the formed elements, which are the cells or cell materials, that is 55% of blood by volume. We have the red blood cells, which transport oxygen for metabolism in the aerobic electron transport chain. Then we have platelets, which help help with blood clotting. And then we have white blood cells, or leukocytes, which is really what we're studying in this chapter. And there are many, many kinds. So I'm going to take this heading of leukocytes and move it to the next slide. So now we're looking at this specific category. You can split up leukocytes into two kinds of cells, granulocytes and agranulocytes. So granulocytes, if you stain them and put them under a microscope, you'll see granules. Okay, so in your micro labs, you would actually see these granules. So I would recommend Google image searching granulocyte microscopy images so you can see. And granules they're basically little tiny dots. So if you stain them and put them under a microscope, you'll see these little tiny dots, and different granulocytes will have different granulocyte cells will have different granule colors. Some will have red, some will have lavender, some will have dark blue, and that can help you identify which is which under a microscope, which I'm not going to make you do, but if you take anatomy and physiology too, you will learn to do that. So I'm just going to talk to you about the different kinds. Agranulocytes, you don't see granules when you stain them. They do actually have granules, but their granules don't pick up stains, so you don't see them under a microscope. So that's how we're distinguishing these two. So granulocytes include all of the granulocytes are part of the innate immune system, which we're covering now. So you'll need to know these. Granulocytes include basophils, which release histamine. Histamine causes inflammation. So we've talked about tumor necrosis factor alpha, which causes inflammation, and now we're talking about histamine, which also causes inflammation. Inflammation helps us fight infection. Also, basophils have binding sites for certain kinds of immunoglobulins, so they can be stimulated by immunoglobulins. Neutrophils, so remember, immunoglobulins are things like antibodies. Neutrophils are mobile phagocytes, so they're phagocytes that can move around via chemotaxis to go to a site of infection. They actually can even move out of blood vessels to go to infected tissue. So they can squeeze, so you have these blood vessels and you have a pathogen that's in tissue outside the blood vessel. The neutrophils can follow chemical signals to the site of infection and then leave the blood vessels to go to infected tissue to phagocytize all those pathogens. Eosinophils produce toxins against parasites. So they produce antimicrobials, but specifically they really focus on eukaryotic parasites like parasitic worms and things like that. Okay, so these are microbes or microbial animals, microscopic animals that are too big for a white blood cell to phagocytize. A neutrophil can only phagocytize something smaller than itself, like a bacteria. So anything that's larger than itself, it can't phagocytize. So that's where eosinophils come in, sort of like natural killer cells. They produce these toxins that can kill things like fungi, parasitic worms, protists, so eukaryotic pathogens. Agranulocytes. Agranulocytes include macrophages. So all the granulocytes are part of the belong to the innate immune system, generalized response. Macrophages are an agranulocyte that's part of the innate immune system. And dendritic cells, these are part of the innate immune system. Macrophages and dendritic cells are antigen-presenting cells. That means they are phagocytes that can talk to helper T cells by displaying the heads of their enemies on their MHC class IIs. And then also all the lymphocytes. The lymphocytes are the T cells, the B cells, the natural killer cells. Okay? So that's how all these cells fit together. This is the function of blood, which includes immune and otherwise. So I'm just going to go back to review real quick. So in your blood, you have the plasma, which is the liquid everything's floating in. Then you have the formed elements, which are the cellular material. That includes red blood cells or erythrocytes, which transport oxygen around the body. They also transport carbon dioxide. So they take oxygen to tissues that need it. They remove carbon dioxide from the tissues that need it. Platelets help with blood clotting, and white blood cells, which are all your immune cells. They include granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes are part of the innate immune system. They include basophils, which basophils release histamine for inflammation, neutrophils, which are mobile phagocytes, eosinophils, which produce toxins against eukaryotic parasites. Then you have agranulocytes. That includes macrophages, antigen-presenting cells of the innate immune system, dendritic cells, antigen-presenting cells of the innate immune system, and the lymphocytes. T and B cells are part of the adaptive immune system. Natural killer cells, we don't really know where they belong. Okay. B cells are also antigen-presenting cells, but they belong to the adaptive immune system. T cells, they don't phagocytize, but they're part of the adaptive immune system.